We're going through a pretty interesting time, and I think you heard some of this from Secretary Paulson this morning. After decades of an expansive period of globalization that has brought many more nations into the global economy, and trade has expanded, and has also been credited with bringing more millions of people out of poverty than anything else, following the recession of 2008, this process is slowed down somewhat by some measures, the process of globalization. At the same time, we seem to be going through a period where public sentiment seems to have soured on globalization and trade. However, at the same time, there are a plethora of trade deals that are on the table around the world, some involving the United States, some not. And many of them have created a lot of emotion and energy, with many people for them and some people against them. However, at the same time, most people agree that it is critical that America retains its competitive edge in the global economy when it comes to innovation, exports, as well as industries of the future. So all of this makes for a very confusing time and period for us. At least if nothing else, it makes for a very confusing political season. Well, at least to get a better understanding of all of this, we're very fortunate to have with us today Fred Hochberg. Chairman Fred Hochberg is the chairman and president of the Export and Import Bank of the United States. This role makes him one of the highest-ranking business leaders in the Obama administration. He's also one of the longest-serving members of the Obama administration. During his 7 years of leadership at the Exim Bank, Fred has supported more, and the Exim Bank have supported more than 1.4 million American jobs and financed exports with a value exceeding $240 billion, while generating more than $2 billion in surplus revenue for U.S. taxpayers. He has also focused on expanding America's global footprint in key domestic industries in which the United States exporters have a comparative advantage. These include renewable energy, aerospace technology, medical products, construction and farm machinery, as well as agriculture. In addition to that, and this is also a little bit part of his heritage, he has spent a fair amount of time focused on small business and small business exports and trying to encourage and finance their activities abroad. Before being at Exim Bank, Fred was in the private sector, but he'd also served for a brief period as acting administrator of the Small Business Administration in the Clinton administration. So we're very delighted to have Fred join us to have this conversation. Please help me in welcoming Fred Hochberg.
I felt I did a very San Francisco thing. I visited Airbnb before coming here, and I took an Uber to get here. And everybody at Airbnb was in Halloween costume. So I told them my costume was an East Coast government official, because I had a tie on and a suit and pants that matched the jacket. So I felt very out of place, particularly when a nun served me coffee at Airbnb. It was just, it's why I love coming out here. So James and I just recounted. We have actually done a number of conversations. This is 4 and counting. And I needled him a little bit because back in March, earlier this year, he wrote a paper about a little pessimistic about renewable energy. And actually, after spending a week out here in California and up in Seattle, I'm far more optimistic. Though I would say that, just to put a finer point on that, when we talk about competition and changing and innovation, in some ways we are, if you think about those of us who had, well, the United States had landline phones, and then the mobile phone revolution came. And in some ways, our power system is like a landline system trying to adapt to a renewable system. And you go to other parts of the world, I'll talk a little bit later about India, which is putting in 175 gigawatts of renewable power. They're bypassing a lot of the base loads, a lot of the coal-fired power plants, a lot of the more traditional power systems that we have. Let me tell you briefly what the Export-Import Bank does. We are the official export credit agency of the United States. We provide loans, guarantees, and insurance when U.S. companies are competing and selling abroad. This was actually started by FDR in 1934, sorry, to encourage companies to expand overseas, sell overseas, and support U.S. jobs, with an understanding that there was partly a fear of selling abroad and a perceived fear about selling abroad. So President Roosevelt said, well, if we have an export bank that will provide the financing that will bypass some of the banks or give banks the assurance, we can create more jobs here at home. So we've been doing that since 1934. We've been in business 82 years. And the fact is, we do make a lot of things. We do export a lot of products and services. And in fact, it may come as a surprise, we are actually the second largest exporter in the entire world. We are only beaten by China. And yet, a decade ago, we were the largest single exporting nation in the entire world. So it's not that long ago, a decade ago, I actually believe, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about it, we could easily be the #1 exporting nation again, partly what's happening here in California. This is home to many innovations and many products and services that are sought around the world. A company I visited down in Orange County called Firm Green, started by a man I've gotten to know, Steve Wilburn, who's a Marine veteran. And he came up with a service and a product that essentially converts methane gas from landfills, and I visited the largest landfill in Latin America outside of Rio, and turns into usable energy. We provided, because it was hard for him to get a loan, and in fact, before he could bid on the project, he was told by the Brazilian authorities, well, where's your ECA? And he said, I don't even know what that is. Where's your export credit agency? And he says, I don't know what that is. They said, well, you better go talk to them before we'll even look at your bid. So we provided a loan guarantee, financing, $48 million, 12 years, about 2.5%. And that enabled that project to be sold by an American company, created jobs in about 7 states. And that's basically the kind of work that we do. Also, while I was in California, I visited SpaceX. SpaceX is owned, as you know, by Elon Musk. We are in a competitive fight primarily with France and Russia, China to a less extent. But France, Russia, and the United States are the 3 countries that both manufacture satellites and produce rocket launches. So we're in a very competitive situation. We make sure there's a level playing field when we're competing, when SpaceX is competing, or the satellite companies, Orbital, Loral, Boeing, and so Lockheed Martin, for example, to make sure that we can compete on a level playing field. This is a competitive market. We have been financing, in the last several years, as much as 60% of commercial satellite launches and satellites to make sure that we can compete effectively against 2 countries, particularly France and Russia, that have a very, I would say, statist view and a very protectionist view of making sure those industries flourish. So basically, we are the export credit agency supporting companies like SpaceX, Firm Green, and many other small businesses. There are about 85 export credit agencies around the world. I have, if you'd like, but we produced a little pocket card. This was actually inspired by one of our great supporters, Senator Lindsey Graham. I went to meet him. We sat on a sofa. He peppered me with a bunch of questions, and then he said to me, Fred, you need a pocket card. And I go, I have no idea what that is, sir. You need a pocket card. I said, I still don't know what that is. He said, you need a pocket card. So I got a pocket card. Now, those of you who really would like, there is a 100-page report. Most everybody is very happy to have this nice, handy, little 2-page, and I'm sorry for the ladies in the room, this was designed for U.S. senators because it fits in their coat pocket. So when they're going to vote, they can just look, I got all the facts, got my talking points, and that's the end of it. So 85 and counting. A number are in what's called the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that sets a framework so that we compete fairly with other countries, and there's a level playing field in terms of the competition. Now, there are a number of countries, more than half are not a member of the OECD, and that's causing some difficulty in the global framework on how we do that. So let me try and just give you a quick overview of what I've seen as I've been chairman of the bank is, James said, I just became the longest serving chairman a week ago, and I'm still the longest serving chairman. Nothing's happened so far, so I'm still the longest serving chairman. One of the things that I've seen is we are seeing when countries are looking to expand and grow and build their economy and put people to work, there are less and less levers to pull. We look at things like fiscal stimulus. President Obama put in a fiscal stimulus package within 2 months of taking office. A very contentious fight. It was $800 billion. There are those, including those in the White House, who wanted more, but that was the most we could get. It was a very contentious battle, as you may recall. It is very hard to add fiscal stimulus. Many countries either have too much debt or perceive too much debt, so that becomes a difficult vehicle to expand economies. Monetary policy, we're at near zero. Europe is at negative interest rates. There's not a lot left that central banks can do to boost the economy. So more and more countries are looking at exports, are looking at expanding exports, and particularly look at an export credit agency as a tool because, one, exports create jobs, it's very visible, and by the WTO, we all have to be self-sustaining, so as a result, it doesn't cost money for legislators and government. So it's a very appealing thing, but it has made the competitive landscape much more challenging for us. We, for example, do make a profit each year, and I will just close with this. We collect revenue, as I mentioned, fees on our interest on loans, or like points on a mortgage. We collect insurance premiums. We do credit insurance. So we take revenue. We put aside a loan loss reserve account in case we have a write-off. Congress allows us to retain about $100 million from what we generate, and the rest we send to you, the taxpayers. Now, where I was in business, sales minus cost equals profit. Guess what? We don't have the word profit in the federal budget. It doesn't exist. The word they use is negative subsidy. Now, it's like when you go to the doctor and the doctor says, looks at the report and the doctor says everything is negative, and you realize that's a good thing. So negative subsidy is a good thing. I will tell you, it took me at least 6 months on the job to be really comfortable that something with the word negative and subsidy was a positive. So we generate a negative subsidy. We just recently sent $284 million to the Treasury in cash. It's a very sad day for our chief financial officer. But it's further evidence that we are self-sustaining, do make a profit, and our job is to help keep American companies competitive and, most importantly, American workers competitive so we support more good-paying jobs in America. So with that, let me join James and we'll have a conversation.
So it is the export and import bank. So you made a case for the export part. Talk a little bit about the import part of it. Why does that matter? Why do you do it?
Well, two reasons. Actually, a former chairman had the idea that we should change our name to the U.S. Export Bank. Then our name would be USEX, and we have enough challenge with Congress and our senators without introducing the word sex into our name. So that's one reason.
Okay.
A second reason is, in the very early days, in the 30s, we would export capital equipment, and we would sometimes finance the import of the products from that capital equipment as a development tool and also as a way of helping those countries pay off that capital equipment. But today, frankly, imports get into our country. They do not need my help whatsoever, so we are purely export-driven. Our name is just an historical name.
Okay. It's always good to clarify that.
And I don't want to include sex in anything we do.
It's a good thing. The theme for this session is protecting America's competitive advantage. You made the point that for a very long time, America was the world's largest exporter. Now China is the world's largest exporter. Talk a little bit about what you mean when you think about America's competitive advantage. Should it just be measured in terms of exports, or are there other measures you'd think about in this global economy?
Well, there are a number of metrics. I mean, I think in terms of, we're one of the least reliant countries on trade and exports. I mean, if for one day global trade came to a total and complete stop, we would be probably less impacted than any other country. We'd certainly be impacted, but it's a less of an impact. So what I'm talking about is, when I looked at it, it's not that long ago that we were the largest exporter. Exports are a larger portion of our economy today than at any other time. We think of the 1950s as being sort of a heyday of manufacturing. Exports were about 5% of GDP. It's been hovering in the 12, 13, as high as 14%, depending on what time of year. So when I look around, and particularly on this visit, I've been on the West Coast for the week, the innovations, the kind of far-reaching thinking about products, technology, renewable energy, electric vehicles, aerospace, entertainment. We have all the ingredients and a good rule of law. Our infrastructure could be better, but it is still better than many places. We have an educated workforce. We have a lot of advantages that I think can propel us. And I think about it, it's a little bit like diet and exercise. If I only diet, it's hard to lose weight. If I only exercise, it's hard to. If you do both, it works. So if we can produce more, export more, maybe we import a little bit less, a lot of things come into alignment very quickly. Balance of payment, more people working. There are a lot of things that will fall into line. So I'm a little more, perhaps in my narrowed focus on my job, I'm a little more focused on exports. And since I took this job, I only buy American wines, mostly California wines.
Okay. Well, you mentioned wines. You've clearly picked a few sectors that you've chosen to focus on. And we talked about some of them, so renewables and aerospace and so forth. Why those sectors? Is it because those sectors you think need the most help, or the ones that are most under threat? Why those sectors?
Sure. Well, probably what I should have talked about is 90% of the customers we work with, 90% are small businesses, and small business defined by the SBA. So that still makes up the bulk of the transactions, are small businesses. We have, and actually, in full disclosure, McKinsey actually did a strategic plan for the bank when I started, and we identified a number of key markets that had infrastructure needs, growing rapidly, and had limited access to capital. And so we looked at a number of locations, and we said, what product categories, mostly on larger scale, large capital goods that need 10, 12, or renewable energy or nuclear power, 18-year financing that are difficult to obtain in the private sector. So what I found, interestingly, is we identified 9 countries, and after 2 or 3 years, those countries actually underperformed the portfolio. But what was outperforming the portfolios were certain sectors. So what the world needs, and particularly emerging economies, we don't call them developing anymore, we have to call them emerging, it's a better term. They need power, and they need infrastructure. So a lot of it has to do with power that's in demand, we have a competitive advantage. In terms of transportation, everything from locomotives to helicopters to crop dusters, agricultural aircraft to commercial aircraft, we have a huge competitive advantage. So we have kind of we go where the money is. Where is there a need? Who comes to us and seeks our financing in order to close the sale? That's really determines what we go to.
So you're
we haven't
really
really
demand-driven.
We're all demand-driven. We have not picked one industry over another. We go those who need us come. One of the reasons I've spent the week out here was there's a large demand for renewable energy and environmentally beneficial power, and we have not been doing as much as the demand I keep hearing from Argentina, Colombia, Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh. So I met with, probably 24 or more companies in the last 4 or 5 days to make sure they understand what we can do and what are their business needs to make sure our financial products keep them competitive.
Well, it's actually good to hear you explain that, because one of the criticisms, as you know, that's often levied on Exim is the fact that you're enacting industrial policy by picking winners and losers. But I think here you talk about the fact that you're demand-driven is actually very important. The other critique you typically also hear is that you're there to help large businesses. But it sounds like, at least with your focus on small and medium-sized businesses, that's not the case.
That's why we've made the point that 90% of our customers are small business. And when I say small business, again, it's defined by our Small Business Administration. It's not my own, not our own little private, handcrafted, artisanal definition.
Right.
It's the universal definition the U.S. government uses.
Right. So given that, I mean, take us through, because, you know, Exim went through a pretty extraordinary process over the last year of getting reauthorization and so forth. Why is it that, given the statistics you just gave about impact on jobs, impact on exports, you shipped money to the Treasury the other day, and you're supporting small and medium-sized businesses, and you're demand-driven. So what's the issue?
I get this question all the time.
Right.
Particularly from small businesses that find it mystifying. You guys, you create jobs, you send money, you make a profit, and if without you, my bank would not make the loan. I think that, let's remember one thing. Although we had a lapse of 5 months and 4 days, and I was counting, we had an overwhelming majority. In the House of Representatives, a majority of the Republicans voted for the Exim Bank, every Democrat except for one. In the Senate, we had a 2/3 majority, every Democrat except for one, who was at one point running for president, was with the bank. So we had an overwhelming majority. However, there was a small minority that had an ideological view that there isn't a role for this, and a lot of them were in leadership. So we had the leader, the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, and the chairman of the Banking Committee were not pro-Exim. We had a number of people in House leadership and Senate leadership that were not pro-Exim. And if you think about if the chairman of a company or the chairman of a board or a nonprofit doesn't want to do something, it was a challenge to work through that. But we had, again, an overwhelming majority. The vote last year was right around Halloween, and so we got 313 votes in the House. So the jack-o'-lanterns in front of our house were carved with 313. So I should make that my password. So it wasn't overwhelming, but we did face a real challenge. Part of the other challenge was we're one of the very few sunset agencies, and we were sunset in our ability to do new loans. So we became an easy target for those who want to show some limitation of government, because if they don't approve us, we had to stop making new loans. We still had to service our portfolio, but we were prevented from doing anything new.
So Fred, you know, we find ourselves in a very unusual place when it comes to trade and globalization. On the one hand, you know, most economists will say trade is good. You know, globalization is a net good overall. Yet at the same time, on the other hand, our current politics say it's not. What's the disconnect? What's underlying that?
Well, I think partly some of it gets, I think, caught up in immigration policy, and I think that these things are not always that discrete in terms of how people make decisions and how they craft their views. I was reading just the other day something like 70% of people do not know what TPP is. Yes. So I think that there's a lot of misinformation. And I will address particularly the business leaders in this room. I think the business community has done a poor job.
Of explaining?
And because the business community is keenly focused on taxes and regulation, and when they're done with that, they want to talk about regulation and taxes, and then at the end of the day, we'd like to talk about taxes and regulation. Now, many companies benefit enormously from trade and exports in particular. It is one thing for the CEO and the head of government affairs to go speak to a member of Congress. It's another thing to make sure their employees are engaged. I was in this small electronics factory in Jackson, Mississippi, and 80 people, and in the lunchroom were about 75 or 80 foreign flags. And it was to remind every employee that's where our sales go. And the week I was there, something like 35% of the production was going to Saudi Arabia. And everybody there knows that. And so they're engaged in trade. They understand that's why they have a good paycheck. So I think the business community could do a far better job of including their workforce in those benefits, so it is not seen as a sort of elite versus working class issue. And our mandate at the Export-Import Bank is purely supporting U.S. jobs. My example is when GE manufactures in the United States and they need financing to sell, we'll back them. If they're going to manufacture in France, that's all very fine and good, but go talk to the French. We do not provide any support whatsoever. It's only about what's done here.
But I would imagine that presumably part of the pushback we're seeing comes from particular communities or particular industries, whether it's textiles and others, that have been adversely impacted by, at least when it comes to jobs, by globalization.
And actually, in our last reauthorization, Congress mandated we put a textile representative on our advisory committee. And I've spent some time in Greensboro, and we actually can be competitive. We're not going to be competitive on cut and sew work. We are very competitive on converting cotton into yarn. And we do a lot of exporting to Asia and to Central America, where it's woven into socks, T-shirts, and so forth. So we have to think about where we have a competitive advantage, which is in innovation, in automated manufacturing. I was in a Caterpillar locomotive plant in Muncie, Indiana, 750,000 square feet, 315 employees. When you walk in, it looks like it's perpetually on lunch break because there's so few people. But we have automated that. We are actually, one of the things that we're actually manufacturing more, but there are less people engaged in it because and that's how we keep our competitive advantage. If we were becoming less and less efficient, we would soon be out of business. But the fact is, we do have a competitive advantage. We have to just focus on those areas.
Right. Now, I mean, you obviously by your comments, raised the point that maybe as we get more competitive and more productive, we're employing fewer and fewer people. Maybe that's part of the pushback on...
That's part of it, but I think we're also, you introduced me to a company called Flextronics. We're going to be, I think more manufacturing is beginning to reshore because if you can automate and there's not that large a labor component to the finished product, there's less and less reason why you'd want to produce something 8,000 miles away and spend 45 days getting it here when you can produce it here and get to market within 24 or 48 hours. Right. So, I mean, Nike is an example. You'll be able to go online, pick the color, the style, the shape, and you may be able to get it delivered in 48 hours. Well, that needs localized manufacturing. There may be less people involved initially, but we have to bring more companies here. One of the things Secretary Pritzker has championed with President Obama is Select USA. We got to get more companies manufacturing in our country. That's how we're going to also support more jobs. And they manufacture here, and then they're going to export from here. And that's a real benefit we haven't really capitalized on until recently.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's actually one of the more remarkable achievements, which is between Select USA and Invest USA, U.S. has actually seen a resurgence of foreign direct investment back in the United States. Given that this session is largely about U.S.'s competitive advantage, we've both made the point that there's all these trade deals on the table, and you've made the comment that we run the risk of sitting on the sidelines when everybody else is setting up trade deals if we keep pushing back on the current trade. Say more about what you mean by sitting on the sidelines.
Well, partly trade became a four-letter word, number one. Two, when the first trade deals we did, NAFTA and so forth, were done in the mid-'90s, there were maybe a dozen trade deals globally. Today, there are over 600. So whether we like it or not, the world is creating free trade deals all the time. And China, for example, has formed their own somewhat version of like a Trans-Pacific Partnership called RCEP, the Regional Cooperative Economic Program, which essentially is stitching together a lot of the countries in Asia and Southeast Asia. So we have a choice. We're going to be, if we don't do a trade deal, we're going to be on the sidelines, and people are going to be trading freely amongst each other, and we will be boxed out of those markets. Before we had a trade deal with Colombia, I was down there, they were buying wheat from Argentina. They preferred wheat from North Dakota, but until we had a free trade agreement, it was too expensive. And with a free trade agreement, that began to change again. So whether we like it or not, that's what's happening in the world, and we have to decide we're either going to find a way to do it well and make sure we protect workers and protect people who are disenfranchised or losing their job, but if we think we can just sit this out, we cannot. One
of the questions that's come through is, because you're in California, in the Bay Area, is What do you see the impact of technology and digitization and what you do and the kinds of small and medium-sized businesses that you support?
Well, I think what I'm seeing mostly is that we are highly competitive. When companies are selling in the market, and particularly the goods we're selling, which are higher technology goods, higher value-added goods, what America offers is looking at the total lifetime cost of a product, not simply the acquisition cost. We make, as I said, locomotives. We're getting to a point where we're producing driverless trains that are being used in mining areas in Australia because the trains run 24/7, and otherwise you've got to somehow helicopter someone to the middle of the desert every 8 or 12 hours to start shifting. So now they're driverless trains. So that gives us a competitive advantage. And that train can be monitored remotely. We have driverless trucks that are being used in mining situations, also American-made from Caterpillar. So this automation, this sort of is giving us that competitive advantage that we're not going to sell market goods. I was down in Monterey Airport. The conveyor belts for luggage leading up to the baggage screening areas were made in Mexico. The baggage screening equipment in terms of protecting people for security was American-made. So those products we have to just keep ahead, and we have a good competitive environment. We have a lot of innovation. We actually celebrate entrepreneurship in this country. So I'm very bullish about that, but it means we have to keep moving and we have to keep changing. We have to keep ahead of the competition, because the competition, and I would say particularly places like China, South Korea, Japan, are moving, particularly China and South Korea, are moving up the value chain very rapidly. So China's producing an airplane to compete with the Boeing aircraft and Airbus. So if we don't move quickly, they're going to come after us.
So in closing, I mean, you may have seen one of the things that's gone viral recently is the note that President Bush left for President Clinton when he came into office, which was a nice gesture on his part, and it's gone viral. If you were to write a note for the next chairman of the bank, what would you tell them?
Well, I would do everything possible to not have our charter expire every 3 to 5 years, because that puts American companies in a real competitive disadvantage and too much uncertainty. We would need to, same thing, we currently, we have a board of 5 people that approve larger transactions. There are only 2. We lack a quorum, so we need to find a way that the next chairman can make sure that we can continue to operate and not have this start and stop. Because I was in business for 20 years. You are not planning a week or 2 at a time. You're planning a year, 2, and 3 years at a time. And we need to make sure we give that assurance. And the third thing is, I think that we need to be focused on what we do well. And when we look at competitiveness, as we're talking about here, it's trade deals, it's infrastructure, it's education, it's thinking about our tax system, all of those things. And certainly, we have an election in a few weeks. We're gonna be looking at that in a new administration, how we address those issues, because that will impact the kind of lives we live, the kind of lives our children and families live, in terms of having a good livelihood and a great standard of living in this country.
Well, thank you, and please join me in thanking Fred for this conversation.
Thank you.